there because she is a very old dog, let me tell you. I believe that we figured out in dog years or human years. She's like 76 years old, okay? She's a little um, long haired chihuahua, I guess you want to call her. So it's not the one dog year to 7 human years because she's so little, but she is old, guys. She's like 15, 16 years old in natural years. So, anyway, and she's toothless. I don't know what to say. But, she still goes. And right now, you will hear her yelp and stuff because I just gave them pork chops and gravy, cut it all up for them. And Charlie eats very quickly, and then he'll sit and watch her, hoping she won't eat it all. And then she will snip at him. It's humorous. That's all I can say. Anyway, let's continue. We're picking back up. See, I told you. She's yelling at him right now. We're going to continue. We're in book 3, chapter 17. I put 17b because I had to stop in the middle because of Bandit. She was whining. So here we go. I may end up reading some that I read before I closed because I didn't mark it because I was in a hurry to help her. So here we go. Again, this is Augustine, The City of God Against the Pagans, edited by R.W. Dyson. It was written in the 300s, latter part, and it is just absolutely intriguing. Chapter 17, B, Book 3. Indeed, we need not ask this or make such an appeal to them, for it is quite certain that they will not bear us any ill will. After all, we speak no more severely and mention no fault more grave than their own authors do, although we are certainly not their equal in style and facility. Yet they take pains to learn, these authors, and require their children to do the same. In any case, if any are angered, what would they do to me if I were to say what Solus says? Many riots, seditions, and at last civil wars broke out, while a few powerful men, to whom most of the citizens gave their esteem, assumed supreme power under the seemly guise of seeking the good of the civic fathers or people. Citizens were indeed called good and bad without reference to their service to the commonwealth, for all were equally corrupt. But he who had the most wealth and power to do harm was deemed good because he defended the prevailing state of the affairs. And that's what Solus said. The writers of Rome's history therefore judged that an honorable freedom of speech required them not to pass over in silence the ills of the city, whose praises they had in so many other places been compelled to proclaim. After all, they had no other and truer city, that city whose citizens are to be chosen for eternity. Why then should we do otherwise? When men impute the evils of this present time to our Christ, the infirm and weak-minded are thereby estranged from that city in which alone an eternal blessed life is to be achieved. Our freedom of speech therefore ought to be all the greater, since our hope in God is better and more certain. In fact, however, we say nothing more dreadful against the gods of the Romans than their own authors, the authors whom they read and commend, say again and again. Indeed, all that we have said we have derived from them, although we are by no means able to speak as well as they do, or say as much as they say. Where were the gods then when the Romans, whom they had induced to worship them by lying trickery, were vexed by such great calamities? Where were those gods whom the Romans deemed worthy of worship for the sake of the slender and false happiness of this world? Where were they when the consul Valerius was slain while defending the Capitol after it had been set ablaze by exiles and slaves? Indeed, Valerius himself was able to bring more aid to that swarm of gods than ever he received from them, for it was he who saved the temple of Jupiter, their greatest and best king. Where were they when that city, worn out by the ceaseless evils of sedition, was devastated by a grievous famine and plague during the brief interval of peace interval of peace while she awaited the return of the emissaries who had been sent to borrow laws from the Athens. Where were they when the people, again suffering from famine, created for the first time a perfect of the market? At the famine took hold, Spurius Malleus distributed grain to the hungry multitudes, but he thereby incurred the charge of plotting to become king. At the instance of this same perfect, that and by the dictate of the aged and infirm dictator Lucius Quintius, he was slain by Quintius Servilis, master of the horse, an act which occasioned a great and most perilous tumult in the city. Where were they when a great pestilence having arisen, the people in their long and great exhaustion resolved to celebrate, oh, I don't know what that is, Liciternura? Listernia, and it's some kind of festival for their useless gods, a festival which had never been celebrated before. Couches were set out in honor of the gods, and from these, this sacred, or rather blasphemous, festival received its name, where they win by fighting ill. The Roman army sustained frequent and great disasters at the hands of the Vians for 10 consecutive years until furious Camulus at last came to its aid, whom the ungrateful city then condemned. Where were they when the Gauls came and despoiled the burnt Rome and filled her with carnage? Where were they when there occurred that memorable pestilence which wrought such monstrous slaughter, in which perished the furious Camillus, who first defended the ungrateful commonwealth from the Vians and then delivered it from the Gauls? This was the pestilence during which the Romans introduced theatrical performances, another new pestilence, not of their bodies, but far more pernicious of their morals. Where were they when yet another grave pestilence arose, believed to have sprung from poison administered by the women who, in such numbers and of such noble rank, that it passes belief, were thereby detected in a crime worse than any pestilence, or when at the Caudine Forks both consuls at the head of the army were so overwhelmed by the Samnites that they were compelled to make a humiliating treaty with them, with 600 Roman knights handed over as hostages. It was on this occasion that the rest of the army, having laid down their arms and been stripped of all else, were forced to pass beneath the yoke wearing only a single item of clothing. Or when, during a grave pestilence affecting what was left of the army, many of the soldiers also perished by a bolt of lightning. Or when, during yet another unbearable pestilence, Rome was compelled to send to Epidaurus and bring back Acapulliapis as a physician god. No doubt the many adulteries committed in his younger days by Jupiter, the king of all, now long seated in the capital, had left him no time to study medicine. Or when the hostile Lusitanians, Brathinians, Samnites, Udocrucians, and Senonian Gauls all conspired together at the same time, so that first Rome's ambassadors were slain by them, and then an army under a predator, let's see, Pater. Okay, I'm sorry. Under a Pater was destroyed. On the second occasion, 7 tribunes and 13,000 soldiers perished, as did the Pater himself. Or when, after pushing... Shh! Charlie, stop. Stop. Come on. Leave her alone. You had yours, buddy. Come on. Come on. Charlie, hold on, guys. Come on. Come on, buddy. Come on. Come on. All right. When, after protracted and grievous seditions at Rome, the common people plundered the city like an enemy and withdrew to the Janiculum. This was so dire a calamity that Hortenius was made dictator, a step usually taken only in times of extreme peril. But having recalled the people to their senses, he then died while still in office. A thing which had never before happened to any dictator. I'm so sorry, you guys. I'm so sorry. Come, Charlie, come. Come on, come on. He ain't going to. He wants her food right now. Okay. Hold on. This surely was a grave reproach to those gods who now had Asclepius among their number. At that time, indeed, when wars were everywhere so frequent, soldiers grew so scarce that Rome was forced to conscript into military service the common people, so called, because being too poor to equip themselves for military service, they had leisure to beget offspring. Also, Pyrrhus, king of Greece, and at that time a figure of enormous renown, was invited by the Tarentines to become an enemy of the Roman people. It was to him, indeed, when he saw. I'm sorry. Charlie, come on. Come. Get over here. Come on. Charlie. Charlie, no. Okay, hold on, guys. He's like bullying her. So we can't let that happen. You know, he's so young and she's so old. And that's like not acceptable. Charlie. No. No. Did you eat hers? Did you really do it, Charlie? Did you really do it, Charlie? Why'd you do that? Why'd you do that, Charlie? Why? Come on. Come on, bud. You have food. Bandit, honey, you need to chill out. Come here, Charlie. Let's get this dentine stick. Will you eat this? There you go. There you go. Eat the dentine. Yeah, eat that. So yours. That smells better. Okay, guys, I do apologize. I had to go do that, but I think he already ate her food. And it's all gone. All right. Where was I? Let's see. Okay, here it is. It was to him, indeed, when he sought to know the future course of events, that Apollo uttered an oracle so elegantly ambiguous that, whichever the two possibilities came to pass, the god himself would seem to be prophetic. For he said, I tell you, O Pyrrhus, that you, the Romans, have power to conquer. And so whether Pyrrhus was to be conquered by the Romans or the Romans by Pyrrhus, the foreteller might safely await either outcome. I'll tell you what, I'm just dumbfounded at some of this stuff. But what appalling slaughter then befell both armies from this conflict. However, Pyrrhus emerged victorious, and so might have declared that, to his mind, Apollo was indeed prophetic, had not the Romans themselves then emerged victorious from the next encounter. In the midst of this dreadful war, there again broke out a grievous pestilence among the women, for pregnant women died before they were delivered. It was at this point, I expect, Alcicapius excused himself on the ground that his profession was chief physician, not midwife. Cattle also perished in the same way, so much so that it was believed that the whole race of animals was about to become extinct. And what of that memorable winter, so unbelievable in its severity, when for 40 days the snow lay horrifyingly deep, even in the Forum, and the Tiber itself was frozen solid? If all this had happened in our own time, would not our adversaries have had a great deal to say? And what of the other great pestilence which raged so long and carried off so many? Despite the presence of Alcipius, it grew much worse as it extended into its second year. And recourse was therefore had to be the Sibylline books. And this kind of oracle, as Cicero reminds us in his work called De Divination, great faith is usually placed in interpreters, who make whatever conjectures they can or wish as to the meaning of the obscure passages. On this occasion, the cause of the pestilence was said to be the fact that so many sacred shrines were now occupied for private purposes. For the time being, therefore, Alcipius was freed from the grave accusation of ignorance or idleness. Why, however, had so many sacred shrines come to be thus occupied without anyone to forbid it? Was this not because supplication had been made to those swarms of divine beings for so long and to so little effect that their sacred places had gradually been forsaken by their worshippers, who assumed that they might at any rate be reclaimed to serve human purposes without offense to the gods? And although in order to abate the pestilence, the shrines were at that time carefully identified and repaired. They nonetheless subsequently fell into disuse again and were once more made to serve human purposes. Had this not happened, no one would cite as proof of Varro's great learning the fact that, in writing of the sacred shrines, he mentioned so many that are otherwise unknown. Meanwhile, there was procured not a defense against pestilence, but only a fine excuse for the gods. Chapter 18. How great were the disasters suffered by the Romans during the Punic Wars, which were not lessened by the protection sought from the gods. In the Punic Wars, victory long remained undecided and uncertain as between the two empires, and the two mighty peoples strove against one another to the utmost of their strength and resources. During these wars, how many smaller kingdoms were crushed, how many broad and noble towns destroyed, how many cities afflicted and lost, how many regions and lands far and wide were laid waste, how often were the victors on either side vanquished, how many men were consumed, whether soldiers in battle or peoples taking no part in the struggle. What numbers of ships, too, were destroyed in naval encounters or sunk by tempests of every degree of severity. If I were to endeavor to describe or enumerate all these things, I should be no more than a writer of history. During this time, perturbed as she was by great fear, the city of Rome resorted to vain and laughable remedies. By the authority of the Sibylline books, the secular games were restored. The celebration of these games had been instituted a century before, but they had faded from memory in happier times. The games consecrated to the gods of the underworld, which had also fallen into disuse in the better years of the past, were also renewed by the pontiffs. And when they were renewed, all the infernal gods no doubt took delight in the sport furnished by the great quantities of the dying men. Indeed, the ferocious wars themselves, and the bloody animosities, and the great victories, first on one side and then on the other, all these things, though most lamentable to men, provided amusement for the demons and rich feasts for the gods of the underworld. But nothing more lamentable took place during the First Punic War than the Roman defeat, which led to the capture of the Regulus, whom I mentioned in the first and second books. Here was an entirely great man, a man who had already conquered and subdued the Carthaginians. He would undoubtedly have brought that same First Punic War to an end, had not his great avidity for praise and glory induced him to impose upon the wary Carthaginians conditions harsher than they could bear. If this man's unexpected captivity and undeserved bondage, his fidelity to his oath, and his most cruel death do not make the gods blush, then it must be true that they are made out of air and do not have blood. Nor at that time was there any shortage of awful calamities within the very walls of Rome. For when the Tiber overflowed its usual levels and inundated almost all the more low-lying parts of the city, some buildings were carried away by the violence of the torrents, and others, waterlogged by the protracted flood, collapsed. This misfortune was followed by an even more destructive fire, which, having consumed certain loftier buildings around the Forum, did not spare even its own proper temple of Vesta, that temple where the virgins, whose task was more a punishment than an honor, conferred eternal life upon fire, as it were, by ceaselessly feeding it with wood. Then, indeed, the fire, which was worshipped in that place, was not only living, but raging. When the virgins, terrified by its ferocity, was unable to save from the blaze that fatal idol which had already brought destruction upon the other three cities in which it had dwelt, the pontiff Metellus, heedless of his own safety, dashed in and rescued it. He was himself half burnt in doing so, however. The fire did not recognize him, and if there had ever been any divine being inside the building, it had by now fled. I'm sorry. Okay. A man, therefore, could be of greater service to the holy things of Vesta than they could be to the man. If the gods could not repulse the flames for themselves, then what aid could they bring to the city whose safety they were supposed to protect against flood and fire? Just so, the facts themselves show that they had no power at all. These objections of ours would be to no purpose if our adversaries replied that their sacred images were set up not to secure temporal goods, but as symbols of the eternal. In that case, they could say that even though corporal and visible things had happened to perish, no harm had been done to those things for the sake of which they had been set up, and that fresh provision could be made for the same purpose. In fact, however, so wonderful is their blindness, they suppose that a city's earthly safety and temple felicity can be kept from perishing by sacred objects which can perish themselves. And so, when it is shown that they suffered the erosion of their safety or the invasion of ill fortune, even while these sacred objects endured, they can only blush at an opinion that they are unwilling to change, yet unable to defend. Chapter 19. Of the affliction of the Second Punic War, by which the strength of both sides was consumed. As to, you better be nice. You, bandit, just stop. As to the Second Punic War, it would be great. I am so sorry, guys. I am really apologetic. I'm sorry. I don't know what is wrong with these dogs. Lay down. Lay down. Why you do that? Shh. Shh. Okay. As to the Second Punic War, it would be too great a task to enumerate all the calamities suffered by the two peoples during their long and wide-ranging struggle with one another. These calamities were so great that the victor was more like the vanquished, and even those who wish rather to praise Rome's empire than recount Rome's wars confess this. Hannibal poured out of Spain, crossed the Pyrenees mountains, traversed Gaul, burst across the Alps, and during his long circuit augmented his resources by plundering or subduing everything in his sight. He swept like a torrent through the Alpine passes and into Italy. What bloody battles were then fought, and how often were the Romans overcome? How many towns deserted to the enemy? How many were captured and subjugated? How dire were the conflicts which so often brought defeat to Rome and glory to Hannibal? And what shall I say of the awful disaster of Cannae, Cannae, where Hannibal, cruelest of men though he was, nonetheless had his fill of butchering his bitterest enemies, and it is reported gave orders that they were to be spared. From that field he sent to Carthage 3 basket loads of gold rings. He did this in order to indicate that so many of Rome's finest had fallen in the battle that it was easier to grasp it by measure than by number, and that the slaughter of the rank and file who lay there, without rings, numerous in proportion to their lowliness of birth, could only be guessed at and not accurately reported. So great indeed was the shortage of soldiers after Cannae that the Romans, by promising immunity from punishment, collected together criminals, and also gave freedom to their slaves, and by these discreditable means did not so much recruit an army as create one. But these slaves, or rather, so as not to do them injustice, these freemen, lacked arms with which to fight for the Roman commonwealth. Arms were therefore taken from the temples, as if the Romans should say to their gods, "Lay down what you have for so long held to no avail, so that perhaps our slaves may make some use of what you, our gods, have been unable to wield." Also, the public treasury at that time lacked funds sufficient to pay the soldiers' wages. Private property was therefore sold for public use, with each man contributing what he had until the senates left themselves no gold beyond one ring and one seal, the miserable insignia of their rank. The members of the other orders and tribes were, of course, left with still less. But if in our own time men were to be reduced to such poverty, who would be able to bear their complaints? We find it hard enough to bear them now, when more is spent on actors for the sake of unnecessary pleasure than was collected then for the legions who were fighting for their lives. Chapter 20. Of the destruction of the Saguntines, who perished because of their friendship for Rome, yet received no help from the Roman gods. Of all the evils which arose from the Second Punic War, however, none was more miserable or more worthy of piteous lamentation than the destruction of the Saguntines. The Spanish city of Saguntum was indeed a most loyal friend to the Roman people, and was destroyed for keeping faith with them. For when Hannibal broke his treaty with the Romans, he sought occasion for provoking Rome into war. Accordingly, he made a ferocious assault upon the Saguntum. And when news of this was heard at Rome, legates were sent to Hannibal to call upon him to lift the siege. Disregarded by Hannibal, they proceeded to Carthage, lodged a protest there against the breach of the treaty, and then, having failed in their negotiations, returned to Rome. In all this delay, that wretched yet most opulent city, precious both to itself and the commonwealth of Rome, was destroyed by the Carthaginians after 8 or 9 months. It is horrible to read of this destruction, and still more to write of it. I shall, however, briefly recall it, because it is greatly pertinent to the matter before us. In the first place, famine gradually consumed the Saguntines, and it is said that they even fed on the dead bodies of their fellow citizens. Then, exhausted by the whole affair, they publicly constructed an enormous funeral pyre, and having first slain their families with the sword, cast themselves into the flames, so that they might at least escape falling to the hands of Hannibal as prisoners. Here, at any rate, the gods should have done something. Thus, gluttons and wastrels were long for the fat of sacrifices, and who deceived with obscure and lying divinations. Here, surely, they should have done something. They should have aided a city so closely allied to the Roman people. They should not have allowed it to perish for keeping faith with them. They had indeed presided over the signing of the treaty of alliance between Saguntum and the Roman Commonwealth. Yet the Saguntines, faithfully preserving the alliance which they had entered into under the auspices of the gods, and to which they had pledged their fidelity and bound themselves by oath, were then besieged, defeated, and destroyed by a perfidious man. If it really was the gods who later, when Hannibal was at the very walls of Rome, terrified him with storms and lightning and drove him far back, they certainly should have done the same on the earlier occasion. Indeed, it would, I venture to observe, have redounded more to their honor had they been able to produce a raging storm on behalf of the friends of the Romans, who were in peril for not breaking faith with the Romans, and who at that time had no succor, rather than on behalf of the Romans themselves, who were fighting on their own behalf and who were well provided with resources against Hannibal. If therefore the gods really were the protectors of Roman felicity and glory, they should have averted the deep guilt of the Saguntine calamity. As it is, however, it would surely be foolish to believe it was because these gods defended her that Rome did not perish at the hands of a victorious Hannibal, for they were not able to save the city of Saguntum from perishing because of its friendship for Rome. If the people of Saguntum had been Christians and had suffered something of this kind for their faith in the gospel, although they would in that case not have destroyed themselves with the sword or fire. If they had suffered destruction for their faith in the gospel, they would then have suffered in hope. They would have suffered in that hope through which they also believed in Christ. a hope not of a fleeting temporal reward, but of an endless eternity. But as to those gods who are deemed worthy of worship for only one purpose, and whose worship is required only for that purpose, namely to secure those things which bring only a worthless and transient felicity, what will those who seek to defend and excuse them say to us about the destruction of the Saguntines? They will, presumably, only say again what they said concerning the destruction of Regulus. There is indeed a difference between the two cases, in that the one concerns a single man and the other a whole city. In each case, however, the cause of destruction was keeping of faith. For it was for this reason that Regulus returned to his enemies, and that Saguntines refused to go over to theirs. Does the keeping of faith provoke the anger of the gods, then? Or can it be that not only individual men, but even entire cities can perish, even though the gods are propitious to them? Let our adversaries choose whichever answer they wish. For if the gods are angered by the keeping of faith, let them seek faithless men by whom to be worshipped. But if men and cities can perish from the affliction of many and grievous torments, even when the gods are well disposed to them, then their worship does not produce felicity as its fruit. Let those, therefore, who attribute their misfortunes to the fact that the sacred rites of the gods have ceased desist from anger. For it may be that even the gods had not only remained with them, but also regarded them with favor. They might still be, not as now, merely complaining of their miserable lot, but like Regulus and the Saguntines in the past, perishing in dreadful torment. All right. I'm going to try to read. Let's see if Bandit will let me. Chapter 21. Of the ingratitude of the city of Rome to her deliverer Scipio, and her morals during the period which Solus describes as the best. Having regard to the limits of the work which I have here undertaken, I leave many things aside and come now to the period between the second and last Carthaginian war. It was during this time that, as Solus said, the Romans lived by the highest morals and in the greatest concord. It was then, during this time of sublime morality and supreme concord, that the accusations of Scipio occurred. It was Scipio who had delivered Rome and Italy, and who had, with marvelous distinction, brought to a close the Second Punic War, at once so horrible, so destructive, and so perilous. He was the conqueror of Hannibal and the captor of Carthage. His life from youth upwards is described as having been devoted to the gods and nourished in the temples. Yet, after his extraordinary triumph, he yielded to the accusations of his enemies, and bereft of the country, which by his valor he had rendered safe and free, lived out the remainder of his life as an exile in the town of Linternum. So little did he desire to return to Rome, indeed, that he said to have left instructions that not even after death was he to be buried in his ungrateful fatherland. It was shortly after this that Oriental luxury, worse than any enemy, crept into Rome for the first time. This occurred through the agency of the proconsul Gnaeus Manlius, who triumphed over the Galatians. It was then that, for the first time, beds of bronze with precious hangings are said to have made their appearance. It was then also that female musicians were introduced into banquets, along with the licentious items of wickedness. It is, however, my intention now to speak not of the things which men do of their own free will, but of those evils which they suffer in spite of themselves. I have therefore recalled the case of Scipio, who yielded to his enemies and died exiled from the fatherland that he had liberated, as being peculiarly pertinent to our present discussion. For those Roman divinities from whose temples he had driven Hannibal gave him no commensurate reward, yet these divinities are worshipped only for the sake of present happiness. But because Solus says that Roman morals were then at their highest, I deem it as well to mention this Oriental luxury also, so that it might be understood that what Solus says is true only when that time is compared with others, during which morals were still worse because discord was more grievous. Again, it was then, that is, between the second and last Carthaginian wars, that the Vocanian law was passed, which forbade anyone to make a woman, not even an only daughter, his heir. I do not know of any law that could be said or thought to be more unjust. It is, however, true that the misfortunes which occurred during that interval between the two Punic wars were more tolerable than those which befell at other times. For the army was then employed only in foreign wars, and was counseled with victory. At home also there were no such furious discords as at other times. But Rome's rival for empire was utterly destroyed in the final Punic War by a single assault launched by another Scipio, who therefore earned for himself the surname of Africanus. From that point onward, the Roman Commonwealth was so overwhelmed by a host of evils arising from the prosperity and security of her affairs that the sudden overthrow of Carthage is seen to have harmed Rome more than did its prolonged enmity. We come next to the period down to the time of Augustus Caesar. Augustus seems in every way to have wrested their liberty from the Romans. But that liberty was in any case no longer glorious even in their own judgment, but full of contention and danger, and now deeply weakened and depleted. He once more submitted all things to the will of a monarch, and in doing so seemed to restore the commonwealth to health in its feeble old age. In the whole of the period, down to his time, however, military disasters were sustained again and again for one reason or another. But I omit these. I also omit the Treaty of Numantia, marred by such terrible disgrace. The Romans attribute this disgrace to the fact that the sacred chickens flew the coop, a fact which, they say, augured ill to the consul Manicius. But that little city had plagued Rome's besieging army for years and had become a terror to the Roman Commonwealth. It hardly seems likely, then, that any other commander had marched against it with some more favorable augury. Chapter 22. On the edict of Mithridates, that all Roman citizens found in Asia should be slain. But, as I say, I omit these things. I certainly cannot pass over Mithridates, however, the king of Asia, who commanded that all Roman citizens dwelling anywhere in Asia where enormous numbers were pursuing their business were to be put to death, and this was done on a single day. What a pitiful thing it was to behold when suddenly, whenever each man was found, in the field, in the street, in the town, at home, in the village, in the marketplace, in a temple, in bed, at a banquet, he was incontinently and godlessly slaughtered. What moans there were from the dying, what tears from those who watched, and perhaps even those who did the deed. For how harsh a necessity it was that compelled the host of these Roman citizens not only to witness this wicked slaughter in their own houses, but even to participate in it themselves. How harsh a necessity it was that compelled them to change their countenance suddenly from the mild kindliness of friendship, and in a time of peace to take part in the business of war. All, I say, were wounded together, the smitten in body and the smiters in soul. Had all these murdered persons failed to heed auguries? When they set out from their homes on that journey from which they were never to return, did they have no household and public gods to consult? If not, then our adversaries have no reason to complain of our own times in this respect, for it seems that the Romans have long despised auguries as vain. If, however, they did consult their gods, then let our adversaries tell us what good such gods did them, even when, at least, by human laws, they were not forbidden. Chapter 23. Of the internal ills by which the Roman Commonwealth was afflicted after a portent to the form of madness in all the beasts which serve mankind. Now let us recall as briefly as we can those evils which were all the more miserable because internal. In other words, let us speak of those civil, or rather uncivil, discords, which were no longer mere seditions, but actual urban warfare, in which so much blood was poured out. Factional strife raged, not now by means of squabbles in the popular assemblies and the exchange of contending arguments, but through the open clash of steel and arms. How much Roman blood was shed, how much of Italy was destroyed and devastated by the social war, servile war, and civil wars. Before Latium began the social war against Rome, all the animals used in the service of mankind, dogs, horses, asses, oxen, and all the other beasts under man's dominion, became suddenly savage, and forgetting their domesticated tameness, left their enclosures and wandered at large. They resisted the approach not only of strangers, but even of their own masters, and no one could venture to come close to them, to drive them without injury or danger. If this was a sign, and even if it was not a sign, how great an evil must have been portended by what was so great an evil in itself. If such a thing had occurred in our own day, we should find our adversaries more rabid against us than their animals were against them. Huh, that's interesting. Chapter 24. Of the civil discord which the seditions of the Gracchi excited. Shh. Just shh. The civil wars began with the seditions excited by the Argarian legislation of the Gracchi, for they wished to divide among the people land which the nobles wrongfully possessed. To dare to attack so ancient a wrong, however, was a most perilous undertaking. Indeed, as the event proved, it was utterly ruinous. What destruction there was when the elder Gratius was slain, and again when, not long afterwards, the other Gratius, his brother, was slain also. For noble and base born alike were put to death, and not by laws or properly ordained powers, but by the conflict of armed mobs. After the death of the younger Gratius, the consul Lucianus Opmius, who had taken up arms against him in the city, and having defeated and killed him, together with his associates, had massacred large numbers of citizens, held an investigation. He now used the device of judicial inquiry to persecute those who were left, and he is imputed to have executed 3,000 men. When what purported to be a judicial investigation produced so many condemnations, we can only guess at how many must have met their deaths during the armed riots themselves. The smiter of Gratius sold his head to the council, as had been agreed beforehand, for its weight in gold. It was also in this massacre that Marcus Fulvius, a man of consular rank, was put to death with his children. All right, I'm going to end that there, guys. Ooh, and maybe a little bit I will finish this book, because then we can go to book 4. But we'll see. Until then, keep your eyes on Jesus and your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And let us embed the Word of God upon the tablets of our hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. Bye-bye.